Hello, I am William Jamal Wright,
And I'm Hattie.
and this is our podcast, HattieJo. What are we doing?
What are we doing?
So, this episode of the podcast, we're actually going to have a discussion about kind of like relationship role models, and if it's necessary to like is it necessary in your future life or in adulthood? Was it necessary for you to have a role, like somebody showing you what a productive and successful relationship is?
Was there anything that prompted this?
Well, so it's just an interesting thing to
I know we kind of discussed
think
it
about.
very
Yeah,
briefly.
but we both have friends that we talk about their relationships with them, and I think, or at least for me, it's interesting to see the various relationships my friends are in, and also the various backgrounds that they came from, because some of them have come from like not what you would call ideal home situations, and they have in their life they have what I would say very successful and model relationships that you'll want to have. But then I have some friends that have they come from like very much loving homes, or at least from what I know, they come
Sure.
from loving homes. Um, but their relationships, I would not say are in the best. They're not relationships that I would model. I would put it that way. And then also there's people that I know and friends that I have that the relationships they have now model relationships that they've seen when they grew up.
Right.
And so it got me thinking of if if you don't have a relationship that when you're growing up, if you don't have a relationship that models what you think, or I'm struggling with my words here a little bit, but
Yeah, I think I know what you're trying to say. If you are not exposed to a relationship that's loving and kind and everything that one might imagine an ideal relation, a respectful relationship, right? Not all relationships are going to work out, but just modeling positive relational behavior and positive self-esteem with respect to the relationship. Not everyone gets exposed to that growing up, and how does that affect them?
Yes.
So I think in my short answer to this, which I'll elaborate on, is that it can play a big role, but I don't want to put any boxes around anyone saying oh, if you weren't exposed to this, you'll never perform that behavior, or if you were exposed to this poor behavior, you will definitely repeat that poor behavior.
Yes.
Just for a pop culture reference, in Jack Pearson in This Is Us, his father was physically abusive to his mother, and his father was an alcoholic. And alcoholism is a different issue because it's not purely your choice behavior.
Yeah.
It is also a disease. So I don't want to make that confused at all. But Jack does have issues with alcoholism, but he also is very clear to not ever hit his wife or be
Abusive, yeah.
violent and physically abusive towards women.
Or his kids.
Or his kids. So that's an instance where I would say he was modeled a poor relationship, but he experienced it and made a conscious choice of that's not how I'm going to live my life, and then did not choose those behaviors. On the other hand, I think it's very common, I'm just going along the theme with relationship violence, for instance, a family where one partner is physically abusive to the other partner, and those kids either will be physically abusive to their partners or will tolerate physical abuse from their partners, because that's what's been modeled to them.
Yeah.
And again, not every child that's brought up with that model will tolerate or be abusive, and
Yeah.
not everybody that is abusive came from that. That's
Yeah,
what I'm trying to
yeah.
say. But I feel like
it's not a
there's
one-to-one.
Yeah, it's not a
there's
one-to-one, but there is a big influence that it's much more likely that you will tolerate abuse if that was something that was modeled when you were small. And I also definitely think that a lot of behavior is learned behavior. You know, kids are teeny tiny and you hear them, go Duke, go Tar Heels. They don't know the difference. That's taught based on what they see and what has been made important in their home. And so that's what they grow up learning and doing.
Sure.
And so if you're taught in your home to say please and thank you and be respectful, and we don't yell, we don't raise our voices, like if someone says no, you have to stop, I think you're much more likely to model that behavior in the rest of your life than in homes where maybe that's less enforced.
Sure.
Or where yelling is really common, and that's kind of how I feel about it.
No, I definitely I agree with your statement, and I think that looking at it there's definitely the ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Where I feel like, or at least for me, growing up, I don't know, I can't remember there weren't very many throughout the families that I saw. There weren't very many successful respectful relationships.
So when you say successful, respectful relationship, can you elaborate more on what that means? Because what that means to you may be something different than what
I would say that respectful relationships and things that first of all, I think there was never at least from my memory
which you were a child, and how much you remember your childhood anyway, and plus being a child biases how you perceive the situation.
So I've said on this podcast before, I grew up in a heavily female dominated, my aunts were very important to me. They very much had a very significant impact on my upbringing
and your grandma
and my grandmother. And so in looking at I don't remember any of them having any sustained relationships, and so they are significantly older than my mother. So that may have happened for whatever reason
in the past years. Right.
But I just when I say successful, I mean relationships that spanned over a number of years, more than 10 years.
Okay.
And where there's respect on both ends, where it wasn't a male it wasn't a male dominated we're gonna just do whatever the male says. I will say this though, I would often go to church, and because I'm from the South, we go to church on Sundays. At least my family did.
That's about right. There's a reason why the Harris Teeter is empty at 9 and 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings.
And I constantly remember people and husband and wives being hey, is anybody celebrating their anniversary this month? And we would always do it on the first Sunday. And then right after the visitors, if you're celebrating your anniversary for this month, you would get up and you'd say, hey, me and my wife or husband are celebrating our 10th or 15th or 20th anniversary. And in my mind I was wow, they have put in so much work, I want that to be me one day.
You remember thinking that?
Yeah, I do. I'm wow, that's pretty cool. And I think that played into my thought process of getting married right after college before I'm 25. So
right, because you gotta rack up those years.
Yeah, in order to have 25 years, you gotta get married.
Right. My grandparents celebrated shortly before my grandfather passed away. They celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary. So not just they were married for 60 years. You have to get married soon for those 60 years to take place. Goodness gracious, that's a long time. So congratulations to them. But anyway, so what does that have to do with your successful relationship? Because you were talking about what, in your opinion, a successful relationship is, and you were saying that incorporates both length, at least 10 years, but you were also saying it incorporates a certain way of treating each other with respect from both parties. And then you said, it reminds me of this time when we were at church.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you...
Well, yeah, so just like the successful, like, and respectful aspects of, like, treating women, for me personally. And I just don't remember, like, I don't remember any males treating women with, like, a lot of respect in the households that I grew up.
And so do you feel like that's because there weren't men around a lot, or was it because they were there but they weren't treating them with respect?
There were some men that were there, and I just don't remember them, like, treating people right, like treating women right.
So do you feel like it's, sorry to keep interrupting you, but I'm just curious, is it, I specifically remember them treating people wrong, or I don't really, it doesn't really stand out to me whether it was treated right. Do you know what I mean? I feel like there are two different things. I don't remember things being treated right versus I definitely remember things being done incorrectly.
So it's a little of both, right?
Okay.
So, like, there were definitely male individuals that, like, I'm like, you definitely didn't treat the woman in your life right. Like, there may have been lying, there's just the whole gamut of, like, mistreatment that, like, one could have in a relationship that, like, I saw throughout my childhood. But it was also, like, the lack of males there. So there were definitely women that I respected and looked up to, and then, like, I knew that they had respect for themselves. So the fact that, like, they may have not have been in a relationship, that meant that, like, somebody wasn't treating them right. Or at least I say.
So you
like,
interpreted their lack of relationship as, I'm choosing to be single rather than choosing to be with someone that's treating me disrespectfully.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, and so that's kind of where I get that kind of idea from.
And so how did, like, when you were growing up, did you ever feel like it was mostly the men mistreating the women, or do you feel like you only saw it that way because a lot of women in your life, as you just mentioned, were choosing to be single, or did you perceive some of the behavior of lying, all this gamut of behaviors? Did you ever notice that going the other direction?
So I mean, I would say that, like, it went the other direction. It wasn't a high frequency though.
Okay.
It was a very low frequency. I remember talking with my grandmother. This is my grandmother, Catherine Waddell, who has passed away. But, like, I remember her talking about, like, how her and her husband, how they, like, began their relationship and, like, resulted in marriage, and some of the difficulties, like, they had, where it got to the point because of, like, the abuse that he had put on her, that she was literally, like, she had enough.
She was at her breaking point.
And she's like, I can't do this anymore. If I'm gonna have kids, like, I want my kids, like, I can't do this anymore. And
So she would talk to you about that?
Yeah, like, as she got older, like, when I would come back from college and stuff, like, I would go and visit her and just sit with her and we would just talk. And so she would just tell me these things, and I just, it was just information that was shared with me on, like, the way that, like, some of the men, or, like, their relationship, and how, like, her husband treated her.
And so what do you think about that? Like, what did you think about that at the time, and what did you think about that now? Like, has anything changed, or is it just I received this information and that's as far as it went, or like, have you reflected on it?
That like she was a very strong woman, and that like she did like everything that she could. She put up with as much as she could, and like I still think the same about her today as I did that day. But I do think that like she was very much in love with him, but that love, like, it reached its breaking point.
Right.
So what about
redeem a lot of things, but not at some point?
So what about you? What do you think, like, in terms of, were there any like influential like relationships or like moments from your childhood that you think impacted how you see relationships?
I definitely think so. My parents got divorced when I was pretty young. Not as young as Jeffrey. So my younger brother Jeffrey has said to me on multiple separate occasions that he doesn't really remember my parents ever being together. So in his kind of memories, he only remembers the after. Whereas Rob and I remember the before, the during, and the after. Though I would say Rob probably remembers it a little bit more vividly than I do the before. So I don't know, I think that was a really unique experience for me because I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before too. I feel like I was raised in some ways, very different. Like I had two very different upbringings, but in other ways they were very, very similar. And so that has had, I think, interesting ramifications throughout the rest of my life, you know, kind of like having two separate like lives almost, like just very different experiences. But one thing that always struck me was, and I've said this to my mom on several occasions, one time recently when she was visiting in March, and she was shocked. I said to her, like, I can't believe you and Dad ever were married. You know, just knowing the two people that you are right now and how on all of the things in the world that you can be, they're like completely opposite on so many of them. But there are certain ones, extremely important ones, that they are the exact same on. So I get why they were able to be successful raising children, and I get why they were able to do so successfully. Successfully both in a marriage and outside of a marriage. Because things like family and respect and children and education are very important to them. And she kind of looked at me like, wow, I can't believe you think your father and I are that different. And I know Rob has expressed that to her, and she was also shocked. But when she's explained it to me, and I learn more about both my parents and see them more as the human beings that they are, and not the mom and dad that I look up to, right? And also going through my own growth and maturation. You know, I can kind of see how people... Mature. More so than I was 10 years ago. I got more to go, I'm sure. But I can see how people can grow and change, and how things in life can happen that have a big effect on you, and how you then choose to go about looking at the world. And so I think that just noticing that people really can grow and change has made me understand a little bit more of, okay, I might actually understand how they were married at one time, and different things happen that can make you go down certain roads that are, now you're at Z, which are very far from A, but little things just nudging you around. It makes more sense to me now how you can get so different. So I think I definitely will say that my parents were very, have similar values. So the way that we interact and treat each other, I think, was very consistent between like my mom's house and my dad's house. And I think was one of the things that made it work for them to raise us in two different homes. Because it wasn't like, oh, at one house we backtalk and are totally disrespectful, but at the other house we, you know, have to be really nice and kind. It's like at both houses we're not raising our voice. At both houses, we're listening when someone else is talking. At both houses, if someone says, stop bothering me, you have to stop. You know, if someone says, help me with this, you have to help. And
I think that, so how do you think that impacts, do you think that has a significant impact on, relationships, though?
Yes,
in the
yes.
relationships
Because, so the other thing I want to contrast this with is I had a really good friend growing up, and her parents ended up getting divorced much later. But we would carpool to gymnastics, we would spend tons of time with each other. And I remember when my parents were going through their divorce, always being anxious and sad and stressed, right? And when they finally got divorced, it was it's just peaceful, it's just better. I still felt, I remember thinking, if my parents can stop loving each other, then they can just stop loving me. How do I make sure that they don't stop loving me? I need to do all these things so that there's no way they can be mad at me or not happy with me or not want to love me anymore. But it wasn't it was still a much better solution for them to be divorced, right?
Yeah.
So where I was going with this whole thing was my friend, we would, like I said, we would carpool and stuff, and I would often go to her house for sleepovers or in between school and gymnastics. And I personally feel like her parents should have gotten divorced 15 years before they actually did. And being at her house was all that same feeling of ooh, I can't believe you just said that to them, or just back and forth arguing, or being, for lack of a better term, downright shitty, and just saying mean things and doing mean things and not helping and actively trying to
just bickering back and forth.
Yeah, and it just, it was not an environment where people listened to what other people had to say. It was not an environment where you didn't raise your voice. It was not an environment where if someone asked you to help, you dropped everything and helped them, right? And so I do think that those little things, just in how you relate to people when you're on your best behavior, feeling good, become your pattern for how you treat people when you're enraged or when you're extremely hurt. And so if in your normal life, if you're not treating people respectfully, there's no hope for you when you're upset, right? Whereas when people get upset, myself included, you kind of lose your comportment and are less likely, and composure, and are less likely to treat people the way they deserve to be treated. However, you're more likely to retain some of that if that's what you do normally. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Well, I'm just curious as how that relates to relationships.
So I guess in my head it's really important, because to me a relationship can only be successful if both people feel respected and valued and feel that they can communicate. Okay. And so I think all of these things that I'm mentioning are descriptions of poor communication or patterns of poor communication. And so, one thing my mom would always tell me is that there's no problem that you can't solve by talking about it, interpersonal problems.
Yeah.
And I think she's absolutely right, but you have to be able to talk about it, and you have to be able to receive criticism. You have to be able to stay calm when someone else is upset, or when someone is attacking you and you're getting upset, to not escalate the situation, right? Or, there's all this concept of fighting fair and everything. I think my parents did a lot of fighting, but from my recollection, it wasn't always fair, but it was much, much closer to that side of the spectrum than other things I had seen as a child. Okay. And I also know that, my mom got remarried to my stepdad, and I have told her, I think, because she feels very guilty for getting a divorce. And I told her, I was like, it was back to peacefulness and everyone could just be happy. So first of all, that's already an improvement.
Yeah.
But second of all, you and Scott have a wonderful, loving relationship. And yes, you fight. And no, it's not perfect. Sometimes you don't fight fair. But in general, it's a really, really good model of here's how two people who love each other treat each other. Yeah. And kind of contrasting to that, my dad never got remarried, but he lived with a woman for about 10 years. We all lived together in her house. And she had a child that was about my age. And while I felt that they had a pretty good relationship for part of it, they eventually broke up. And I do not feel that they had good communication. And I do not feel that there was respect for my dad from this woman. Mm-hmm. And I definitely do not feel like she had respect for us kids. That is clear. Mm-hmm. And so I feel very much that in these two scenarios, it was like, here's how you treat people nicely that you love, here's how you are not doing that, and you're kind of being shitty all the time. And it's like, it was not an environment growing up at my dad's house that was stressful, like when my parents were going through their divorce. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. It was still relaxed, and I love being with my dad, and I love being there, and we did all sorts of fun stuff, and it was an enriching environment. But it was still, I don't perceive it to be looked at as a loving, successful relationship. Yeah. And even if they were still together, I don't think I would perceive it to be a loving, successful relationship. Because I think there was a lack of communication and respect. So I know that's kind of like a long, that's
well, no, it's good. Like, it's good to like talk about these moments that like have an impact, and like it goes back to like our question of like, do you need to have someone model good like relationships in order for you to have like a successful relationship? Mm-hmm. And it's funny thinking about that question in terms of like kids, and like I definitely think it depends on like the age. Mm-hmm. Like the age that you have like a divorce, or like the age that like maybe like I'm thinking specifically of like bad relationships, because I think that definitely like seeing parents or seeing like family members in like bad relationships, I think that has a higher replicable rate.
Yes. Right. I think it's easier to repeat the bad stuff than it is to repeat the good stuff.
Yes.
And I also think it's easier or more common for someone to have a good model and then still have bad behavior.
Yes.
Than it is to have, I had a bad model, but now I'm in this great, you know what I mean? Like, I think just the bad stuff is more common, and part of that is human nature.
Yes. And it's easier. Like, it's easier to yell at somebody, or like...
Right, and it's easier to be like, I'm going to do what I want. Right?
Or like somebody else.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to say that by any means that anyone's relationship is perfect, or that anyone is perfect. There's always problems, and there's always things you can work on. But I think, I agree with you that it's not for certain, but it definitely helps to have positive models. And I think it especially helps to have maybe the contrast, because if you only experience negative, that's what you expect, right? Oh, dad's always hitting mom, or like dad's never here, or mom's always lying to dad. Like, I'm not going to be surprised when my boyfriend's lying to me, or I'm not going to have any reservations about doing whatever, because that's
becomes
normal.
The norm,
right?
It just
becomes normal. The norm. Why would I expect anything else?
Yeah.
Right? And so, likewise, if you're raised in you have a great model, yes, the norm is a great thing, but then we just talked about it's easier to display certain behaviors, and then if you add to that the stress of life, it's much easier to revert to poor behaviors when you're stressed.
Yeah.
And so...
It's funny about this, like, idea of having, like, a good relationship, and, like, at least for me personally, like, I've definitely been, like, in relationships that maybe had on, like, a difficult time, or, like, a rough, like, patch, and I was like, we don't have a good relationship, it's time to end it, get out of here. Like, see you later. This is definitely like not what a good relationship is. And like, it wasn't like a sustained like issue. It was just like a rough patch. And I guess in some ways, like my like upbringing and like seeing relationships, like that informs like, oh, like if everything isn't smooth all the time, then the second there's a rough patch, then you might want to get out of Dodge, because that's
right. Well, and that's something I kind of grew up too with, like, oh my God, they could stop loving me at any moment, so I better make sure that there's like nothing going wrong, you know what I mean, that might incite some bad outcome. So yeah, I fully get where you're going with that, but that's kind of why I think the contrast between a good and a less good is useful, because you can perceive what it feels like. Oh, it does feel better when people are honest and respectful to each other. Oh, there is a different way to converse with people than yelling and fighting and slamming the door or giving a cold shoulder or saying, you know, oh, there's another way. Other thing, like the biggest takeaway that I got from just in general watching other people go through relationships and going through relationships of my own, is that, you know, kind of this concept of no one's perfect, and you have to decide what you're willing to give up and what we've talked about the non-negotiables. Yeah. Well, and that's something my mom, my parents have said that to me many times. Of, you know, you have to decide: is this the hill I want to die on, or is this something I can get over? And I think a lot of times people lose sight of that. Like, if the person's not perfect in every way, oh, I'm bailing. But no one's going to be perfect in every way.
Well, but I feel like, so I said,
you don't want to settle.
I gave my like example of like the rough patches and like, but like I feel like there are a lot, like it's way more skewed towards the I'm gonna hang in here and like during the bad things.
Yeah, because
it's
like,
way
honestly,
more
when you first said like, oh, you know, something bad happens, I'm jumping ship, in my mind I was like, you? Like, this is the guy that can't break up with people and like always stays in a relationship for way too long. Well, that's what I do too. But so I was just kind of surprised that that's what you said, because I was like,
So I will say this, like the whole jumping ship is just like an emotional jumping ship. Like, this relationship is not gonna last. Like,
so you're still in the relationship.
Yeah, I'm still in the relationship.
Emotionally, like, nah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, this isn't gonna work out. Like,
we may still be together. Emotionally invested. We may still be together, but I'm no longer emotionally invested.
Yeah, which is a horrible way to be.
But again,
yeah, you live
in
your
life. It's the easier way.
Yes,
you know,
it is the easier. It is the easier road travel.
Yeah.
It is the easier road travel. But I was just trying to point out that like in a lot of relationships, you're much more likely to like, as opposed to this, oh, like I only see good things. Like, if our relationship isn't great all the time, then like I'm gonna leave. Like, yes, that is an aspect, but like there's a lot more of, oh, like this relationship isn't going well, and I'm gonna try and stick it out, and like hopefully like we'll get to like a better place.
Well, and that's why I think that the communication is so important, because all relationships are going to have rough patches, but when you start feeling like we've tried this communication and it's not working, or we've tried to come up with a solution and someone's not upholding their end of the deal, or even if they are, I just perceive that they're not, like that's a problem, you know. And so being able to communicate effectively through those rough patches is what helps you get to that better place. And if you can't do that, then it's like your grandma Catherine, and it's like, I can't do this anymore. And so that's why I think that the communication part is so important, because you'll never be able to get past those things. And I think that having the model of forgiveness and kind of talking things out, or deciding, just kind of giving people more grace, I guess, is another really important model. Because I think a lot of times
I think most people, I think they give a little bit too much
much
grace.
grace?
Yeah.
This is interesting. Let's talk
I
about
would
this.
say people give way too much grace.
I guess I've come from more the perspective. I guess what I'm trying to communicate is, sometimes you have to just, if you still love the person, but like this one little thing, you just have to give it up, give it a rest, right? Whereas I think you're coming more from the perspective of, you're letting them walk all over you. You need to stand up for yourself.
I'm just coming from the perspective of like, just these little things just keep adding up, and at some point you gotta like not put
take
up
it
with
anymore.
Yeah, just gotta be like deuces, which is very hard. It's not easy to just say deuces.
It's really hard, especially
Speaking
if you
here
have
from
other stuff going on. Yeah.
Speaking here from experience, it's not easy to just break up with somebody and just say I'm done.
Right.
Well, I definitely like, just to kind of close this up here, I definitely think it depends on like, in terms of modeling, it's definitely easier to like model bad behavior that you see in a relationship.
When you say it's easier to model bad behavior, you mean it's easier if you've been exposed to bad behavior, it's more likely that you will turn around and do that?
Yes.
Okay.
But like, it is not impossible, but it is very difficult to like see bad behavior in a relationship and not like repeat it. It is very difficult because that bad behavior becomes the norm. And that would be where, but it like that the age at which you're exposed to that like maybe unhealthy relationship, or the age that you're exposed to like a healthy relationship, I think that plays a huge part in like what the individual will then in turn choose to model.
Interesting. Well, with that's what we've been doing. Hopefully your relationships are good. From
Deuces.
Communication. Non-negotiable. I just had to throw that in there when we're done.